linear action-adventure platforming games as a genre are now a rare beast within the AAA gaming industry. All of the concepts are still around, but they're now used more as flavour within larger, supposedly more immersive open worlds. This was not always the case. Before franchises like Assassin's Creed brought about a sea change through the 7th generation of consoles that benefit from increased player choice, and they do cater to multiple playstyles, but they can unfavourably be described as feature bloat. One of the arguments often put forwards for larger game worlds are the opportunities for greater storytelling, but this is not necessary. And the best argument to this effect can be seen in Ubisoft's own 2003 platforming mega hit, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. Prince of Persia, however, was not a Ubisoft created franchise. Series creator Jordan Mechner had begun game programming as a side project while studying at university, and released several games in collaboration with the publishing company Broderbund. The most notable of these, a platform game inspired by the Indiana Jones movies and the 1001 Arabian Nights tales, the game was critically applauded for its impressive, for the time, rotoscoped animations and weighty, realistic gameplay. It was also notable, however, for being incredibly challenging, combining difficult to master controls, a challenging time limit, and a wealth of traps and hazards designed to catch the player out. The original game was ported to 17 systems over the following 5 years, and, despite poor initial sales, turned into a juggernaut franchise that spawned 2 sequels, one 2D in the same style in 1993, and one very early 3D platformer in 1999. That last game was rushed through development as the publisher Broderbund struggled financially and sold the brand on. In 2001, Ubisoft purchased the rights to the catalogue and tasked their Montreal studio with reviving the dormant series, with series creator and IP holder Mechner brought on board as the writer and lead designer. The game told a brand new story, featuring a bold, brash, arrogant, self-righteous prince as both the dual protagonist and narrator. It begins with a short tutorial prologue during the ransacking of the Indian Maharaja's palace. Setting the story from the prince's viewpoint instantly draws the player in, and the expert delivery from Yuri Lowenthal disguises the abhorrent actions of the character whose own pride and arrogance brings about the doom of his family and everyone around him. For the majority of the game, you're fighting possessed sand creatures, horrific demonic monstrosities brought about by the corrupting influence of the titular sands that the prince has accidentally unleashed. Each kill is presented more as a means of him undoing his own mistakes, rather than an act of violence. But here, at the beginning, you are killing innocent men, and the prince bluntly states that he saw the destruction of a kingdom and thought only of the honour and glory that it could present him. He's not a monster. He does not relish in the slaughter, but he is pragmatic and sees it as a means to the end. This puts him in sharp contrast to the game's secondary character Farah, kidnapped at the end of this prologue, and the only other person to have escaped the destruction brought about when the prince unleashed the sands. After fleeing from this disaster at the start of the game, these two protagonists have to climb through the palace, from the caves beneath the Sultan's zoo, through to the baths, into the harem, up through the observatory, over the ramparts and into the tower where the evil vizier awaits guarding the hourglass. Farah is armed with a bow and arrow and can protect herself to a certain extent, and is also able to slip through small gaps such as under doorways and through cracks in the walls that the prince cannot. As the palace is full of traps and hazards to deter thieves or invaders, the two have to work in tandem to permit progression. All of this is accompanied by constant dialogue between the prince and Farah. Neither trusts each other. He did invade her kingdom, ransack her palace and kidnap her after all. But they need to collaborate to escape this nightmare. This necessity leads to tolerance, then acceptance, then eventually affection, and this was revolutionary video game writing from Mechner for the early millennium. What was most impressive was how the script was tailored specifically to fit within and around the gameplay at all moments. There are no sections that feel forced, assuming the player can accept the absurdity of the palace architecture, which seems specifically designed to murder its inhabitants. Also considered revolutionary was the traversal mechanics. The design philosophy of the team was to present a platformer that was realistic, following the lead of the original games, but also captivating and free-flowing. Inspired by parkour runners, they settled on a control scheme where the shoulder buttons trigger the prince to start wall running, and this, rather than jumping, became the main means of traversal. In one brilliant decision, the main critical flaw of all of the other 3D platformers of the time was overcome. There are no moments where the player is having to watch their footing or judge where they're going to land from a normal jump. Instead, it becomes a question of timing and direction. The prince can ascend directly up or cross sideways along any wall, climb and swing from poles, and jump off any wall he gets solid footing on. The designers clearly enjoyed building levels around this elaborate moveset, which allows for environments to have intricate horizontal and vertical components. Controlling the prince remains a joy, although the parkour mechanics are disrupted by occasional block and lever puzzles designed to make the player consider the world around them more critically. The most obtrusive of these, such as the gear pillars early on in the game, bring a complete halt to the otherwise free-flowing game loop, but they are mercifully few and far between. The traversal mechanics are brilliant, but they are also unforgiving. Whilst mistakes are far more likely to be caused by player fault than many of the contemporary games, that does not make them any less common. Instead, in another moment of beautiful cohesion between game design and narrative, the player has a limited ability to roll back the game and replay the moments leading up to any mistakes. This action replay feature was a brilliant crutch, ensuring that no time is wasted between attempts of challenge, and both the combat and the parkour benefit from its inclusion. Although it could be described as a crutch, it does not actually help the player in any way. You are still in control, and you need to play the game on your own. However, the knowledge that some mistakes can be forgiven can actually aid concentration. Certainly, a few moments in the last levels where this power is taken away from you suddenly feel much more claustrophobic and unforgiving, despite the fact that mechanically they are relatively simple compared to what came before. There are moments of this game that present relatively unforgiving difficulty spikes for any player who does not understand and utilise all of the gameplay mechanics. Fighting the sand-possessed guards throughout the game falls into a simple loop for the discerning player. Most enemies will block most attacks, so a combination of leaping over the weaker enemies, or wall jumping to attack the stronger ones, can make short work of most hazards. The challenge of combat is presented purely by quantity over quality, as waves of multiple enemies will ambush you at once. As only the dagger can actually kill these creatures, all other attacks will just temporarily stun them. Opportunist players too focused on the enemy ahead will find themselves swarmed by the foes around them. When accompanying you, Farah can defend herself to an extent, using her bow to keep enemies away, but if one takes a specific interest in her, the prince will be required to step in. The elevator battle towards the end can be particularly frustrating as, cornered in a tight area, dozens of stronger and stronger enemies will surround the prince. Whilst most attacks can be blocked, the player can be pinned into a corner, kept waiting for a chance to strike back and break free whilst Farah is beaten down out of sight. Moments like this are rare, but the occasional difficulty spike, such as a checkpoint that loaded after I had entered an arena, having forgotten to refill my health from the previous room, and was faced with a multi-wave battle with almost zero health, can come across as unfair compared to the balanced and cohesive game that surrounds it. Overall, combat of this game was sound but fairly basic. It did, however, set a template of free-flow combat that was cited as an inspiration for not just the Assassin's Creed franchise, but the Batman Arkham series, Mad Max, and Insomniac's Spider-Man. The links between the Sands of Time and Assassin's Creed go further than that, however. After completing a trilogy of games around the Sands of Time concept, game director Patrick Desolé wanted to find a new protagonist for future games. He suggested that a new spin-off series could be created, where the prince was an AI-controlled child, and that the player should instead control an assassin tasked with setting out into the kingdom to protect the child from outside threats. This concept, once it was prototyped, was considered so strong that the ties to the original series were cut, and Ubisoft's next mega franchise was born out of the DNA of this progenitor series. However, sequel after sequel within the Assassin's Creed franchise, each bringing larger and larger open worlds to explore, there is a beauty in going back to this original design template. The Sultan's Palace is not enormous, but it does host a dense, finely constructed adventure where the focus is on forward direction.